Nicci Wright, welcome to Tales Less Told.
Thank you very much.
Now, you're a wildlife rehabilitation specialist at the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Hospital.
I am,
That's
yeah.
right. Now, that name gives a few clues, but can you tell us more specifically what you do here?
Okay, so this is a hospital for indigenous wildlife, for injured and ex situ and confiscated indigenous wildlife, small to medium species. And it's the first of its kind actually in Gauteng, definitely. And we're situated just outside of Johannesburg, and we receive wildlife from all over the country basically, comes in.
Now, you said small to medium sized. What's the largest kind of animal that you might have here?
We could have like a medium-sized antelope, I guess, caracal, serval, that kind of thing. Variety of birds of prey. We've got 2 secretary birds in at the moment, which are, you know, quite big birds. So yeah, quite a range. But we do have enclosures. You know, there's obviously a rehab process that goes on with each different species, and it's quite specific to each different species. And we have enclosures all over the country as well, where these animals will be released from.
Okay.
So they go from here, from the hospital where they're treated or hand reared, and then they go into an enclosure here on the premises, and then they go out to wherever the suitable habitat is for them, and they have a slow release process there.
Okay. So it's a hospital, so you only treat animals which have been injured, is that correct?
Well, injured or displaced, or ones that have been confiscated, so they've been pets essentially. You get all sorts of things happening in people's backyards, some of which are quite horrific. So you need to then get those animals in and get them onto correct diets, because some of them have never seen their natural food. They've been fed on, you know, steak or mince or something, which, you know, things don't eat in the wild. And so you've got to get them onto their correct nutrition and get them to recognize their natural food items, and check that their nutrition is right, because often when people have kept things illegally, they will come in with things like metabolic bone disease, which is rickets essentially. And so you've got to correct all of those things, and then if hopefully you end up with a whole animal that knows who it is, what it eats, where to find it, and can behave like a caracal or a serval or a meerkat, and then you can work from there as to their release process.
I heard some strange whooping before. I'm not too sure if you can pick it up. I've got a little microphone in my ear. You told me, was that a meerkat?
Yes, it is. A Surrey cat, or a meerkat as they're commonly known here, and they are one of the most common species that are kept illegally as pets in South Africa. So they're bred in people's backyards, and we find that as the economy sort of dips and goes up and down, people will start these little backyard businesses, you know, and meerkats breed quite easily in captivity, and then they're sold for about 1,800 Rand to 2,000 Rand for a tiny little pup with its eyes still closed.
So that's approximately, what, about $150 or so?
Something like that,
for
yeah.
a little pup
Little
meerkat.
tiny thing with its eyes still closed, which is going to be fed a formula and you know, made dependent, essentially kept dependent on whoever's raising it. And I mean, they're very sweet when they're babies. All babies are sweet, you know, even human babies are quite sweet. But
I'm sure.
Look what happens to us.
Well,
you know.
yes.
Yeah.
Adolf Hitler could have been a cute little baby.
He
Who
could
knows?
have been. He probably was. You know. Anyway, so and then what happens with these things is because they're essentially not domesticated. They're wild animals. So eventually their instincts will start coming into play. They become hormonal, and if anybody knew what they were getting into, they would never have a meerkat as a pet, because those animals live in a group, so they're highly social. They have about 38 different vocalizations for things, so they're constantly communicating. And when they're kept on their own in solitary confinement, as it were, just with people or dogs or cats as their group, they don't have anybody vocalizing back to them, so that nobody speaks their language. And they will eventually at some point start becoming hormonal and aggressive. And the whole structure of a meerkat group in the wild is that they have an alpha male and female system. So those two rule the whole group. Only those two breed, And in a home situation, that meerkat has that hardwired. So he's trying to get to the top dominant position through the dogs, through the children, through the visitors, and will bite his way and fight his way to that position. So usually when they've bitten the kids, that's when they bring them in and say, no, we can't have this, it's biting.
So, well, this might be an obvious question. Is it legal to have a meerkat as a pet?
No, it's not.
Okay, so the people who are, you get a knock on the door one day and say, here, we can't keep this meerkat anymore. In itself, it's an admission of being guilty of a crime.
Yeah.
But you'd rather, I guess, rehabilitate a meerkat than have it
we do.
drowned or something rather like that.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Or put in a cage in the backyard, which we've had before, and these animals, pretty often because they're being kept in an isolated situation away from other meerkats, they become psychotic. So they start self-mutilating, they start chewing the end of their tail because their needs just cannot be met. They're often fed, incorrect food. We had one that came in who had 9 fractures in her body from her waist down because she'd been raised on chocolate and popcorn and nonsense,
So the meerkat wasn't getting the calcium that it needed? She wasn't getting
the correct calcium
right.
at all. And so everything you touched just broke.
So those are instances of people who've had these meerkats, for instance, as a pet. Do they go in it with the best of intentions as a pet owner, or?
I don't think so.
No.
I think people who look at a wild animal and think, oh, I'll have that. That's cool. That's different. Are not thinking of the animal.
No.
You cannot reproduce the Kalahari Desert in your suburban flat.
Yep.
And whether it's animals that are indigenous to South Africa or wildlife that comes from other countries, which is termed exotic, which don't require permits to keep in this country. It's wrong. It's a wild animal. It's got wild instincts and needs, and we cannot reproduce that. Zoos can't reproduce that most of the time. So why would a lay person be able to? And it's just, I think it's just, it's unethical completely.
Tell me, let's say a meerkat is not, following on from this example, it hasn't been injured as such. Perhaps luckily the diet was quite good, but it's unsocialized. How do you get that back into the wild as a responsible member of meerkat society?
Exactly. Yeah. It's amazing how animals' instincts work, and if you start stimulating those instincts, they'll remember them. They're latent, so it doesn't matter how long something's been in captivity, those instincts will still be inherent in that animal. So you put it in the correct place, you give it the correct food, you give it the correct stimulation, and you'll be stimulating those instincts, and that animal will eventually realize or remember that it's a meerkat. And you start slowly introducing it to other meerkats or other mongooses or other antelope or whatever the species is, providing they're social, of course. And they will slot in. Sometimes there's fighting. I mean, they don't want a newcomer. They have to discipline it and tell it where it lives, where it is on the ranking, and they'll start off at the bottom. But they'll often make themselves really useful. So in meerkat world, for instance, you need to have sentries, and you need to have nursemaids, and you need to have all sorts of useful functions. You need to be fulfilling a role, otherwise you're a useless member of that group.
Okay.
So you'll find they suddenly realize they've got to be a sentry, and they're standing up on things looking for birds of prey, or if there are babies born to that group, to that alpha male and female, then you'll get meerkats taking over the nursemaid role and making themselves useful, and that just gets stimulated by the situation that they've been placed in. So what happens here is they go up to the Northern Cape, and they get put into enclosures and slowly introduced to other meerkats, and a group is formed. Then they get put into a safe environment up in the Northern Cape, into a pre-release enclosure.
The group?
Yes,
the entirety
whole
of the group.
Once the group is formed, and is functioning as a group. And then once they are habituated to that area, so don't forget, these are meerkats that have come often from urban areas, and they might never have seen or heard a jackal or a caracal or a bird of prey flying overhead. So they've got to be exposed to all of that stuff in a safe way, And then once they're responding correctly to all of those stimuli and met all the neighbours, so to speak, then they get released, but they're support fed until they don't come back for food.
Okay.
So it's a long, slow process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned before that instinct plays, it's hardwired into these meerkats. And we will get onto other animals in a moment. How much it is, excuse me, my thing's falling out of my ear again. How much of it is, what would you call it, copying or learning from the behaviour of the other meerkats in the family?
Well, if you behave oddly in a group, the group usually tells you.
Okay.
So, I suppose that's got something to do with it.
Interesting. Does the alpha male dish out the punishment in that environment?
And then the whole group can support him in that.
Right.
And it gets nasty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's meerkats. You mentioned secretary birds, did you?
Secretary, there's so many species.
Tell me
I've worked
the
with
other...
over 350 different species of indigenous animals, so you can talk about anything you want.
Well, I could point to a holding here.
Yeah.
Tell me of one or two other ones that you have here at the hospital right now.
We've got serval. We've got 3 serval. We've got
serval are a cat, aren't they? A small cat.
It's a type of a cat, yeah. So it's a medium-sized cat with cat-type creature with long legs, small head, an attitude, and they've got spots on them, and very, very pretty animals. And they love to live. They live in grassland areas, preferably, and they like living near a flay or a wetland. We call it a flay area here, but it's a wetland everywhere else, because they predate mainly on a type of rat called a flay rat, which lives in a marshy sort of area.
Yeah.
It's their favourite food. So we've got 2 youngsters that have been picked up on a farm, almost dead. Obviously the mum had been killed or snared, or something had happened to her and she hadn't come back. So we managed to kind of hoik those back, and they're about to go into a pre-release enclosure now.
That's a happy story. So these weren't kept as pets. They were, a farmer found them on his land, orphaned, as you suggest, perhaps, and did the right thing. Did he just by chance know about your organisation?
Usually people will phone like their local vet if they're from out of our area, and their local vet will know about us, or they'll Google wildlife and they'll find the hospital come up. But we've got quite a reputation already. I mean, we're quite well known already. So for injured wildlife, a lot gets referred here.
Okay. I had an experience a few months ago. I was in a wildlife estate in Limpopo, and I saw an antelope in distress. I guess it was caught by something in its foot, and I slowed down. I was driving, and then and sort of tried to see what it was. I thought instinctively it was snared, and as it saw me approach, it got more distressed. It actually did a 360, and I thought, well, okay, all right, stay back. And then I called up, I was put in touch with the manager of that particular estate, and his response to me was, we don't interfere with nature. Now I thought, well, okay, if it's snared, it's not nature. And he wasn't, and I said, listen, I think it might be a snare, and I kind of pushed the point. And he kind of eventually sort of ummed and ahed a wee bit. I then drove back to see the thing, and by that stage it had escaped. It must have pulled the thing out or done whatever and then run off. Now that's one example. There are other examples perhaps where people might see an injured animal in the wild, and the general thing that you might hear from certain rangers or field guides or such and such, is that, well, it's part of nature, let nature take its course, and let it be supper for some other animal. What's your view on that?
I agree. If it is in a big natural area like Kruger Park, unless it's one of the endangered species, I think then you would leave it to nature.
Okay.
But where wildlife rehabilitation comes into it is when you have that interface between people and wildlife. Around every city there's development mushrooming out. And that interface, there's going to be animals that are affected, whether they're snakes or scrub hares or small antelope, that kind of stuff. And even out in wilder areas, you've got these wildlife estates which are managed. I mean, they might seem like large areas, but they're managed. They've got fences and they have, water issues, and animals are dependent on people managing that properly. So even in countries like South Africa, there are very few large enough areas to say, well, there's no human intervention there, let's just leave it to nature. So wherever there's human-wildlife conflict or interface or overlap, there's going to be animals that are injured or snared or poisoned or run over or caught for the pot or caught for the trade or whatever it is. And that, to me, is there's a moral and an ethical obligation to help assist those cases, I feel.
Of the animals that come into the hospital, how many have been, or perhaps what are the different channels that they come through? You mentioned before that some people have given up wanting these things as pets rather. Others might be confiscated. Others might perhaps be saved from a poaching gang or something or other. How do the animals arrive at your doorstep?
So we work closely with the National Council of SPCAs, and they have a wildlife unit which works nationally. And as one of their accredited facilities, they bring a lot of stuff through to us, a lot of cases, which can be from anywhere in the country. We work very closely with our provincial conservation authority, the Gauteng department, and they also bring confiscated wildlife through to us. We work closely with anti-poaching units and those sort of other departments throughout the country that work with that kind of thing, illegal wildlife trade or syndicates, that kind of thing. So we'll get cases from them too. And then also from ordinary vets. So you'll get a small practice vet in Johannesburg and somebody brings a garden bird or a tortoise or something that they've found or discovered, and those vets don't specialize in wildlife or exotics, as they call it, so they'll send it through to us.
Are there a shortage of wildlife vets in the country?
I don't think there is a shortage. I mean, there are a number of wildlife vets, excellent wildlife vets, thank goodness. But there are no facilities exactly like ours. We're an MPO, so we don't charge people, obviously, for the wildlife that comes in. We generate funds as a charity to run the hospital.
Okay.
So that's what makes us quite unique.
Before we close off the interview, we'll address the various links and
Yes,
let's do it now. Where can people find out more about
what we do?
About you do
You've
online?
got a very active Facebook page, so we put up all sorts of stories and requests and interesting stuff quite frequently. We've got a web page as well. So if somebody just went onto Facebook and looked for Johannesburg Wildlife Vet, we'd pop up and you could go through to our other things. Instagram we're on.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And what are the kind of things that you require to keep running?
Money.
No. that was a given.
Yes. Okay. Apart from, I mean, there are all sorts of ways people can support us. Food, animal food.
Yep.
That's listed on our website. Towels, cleaning equipment. They can sponsor our insects every week. We get, we've got a lot of animals that only eat insects, animals and birds. So we spend thousands of rand every week on insects from a supplier.
I'm just learning now. So there is such a thing as insect breeding.
Absolutely, big business.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a whole exotic pet industry out there. With your bearded dragons and your all those sort of animals. And they all require specialist feeding, and so you've got guys breeding mealworms and crickets and hissing cockroaches and all sorts of things.
Do the animals require live food for the most part?
We don't feed anything live food, no. First of all, it's against the law.
Is it?
So yes, it's against the Animal Protection Act. So live feeding of things, even to snakes, they don't require it. We have wild snakes coming in here that we feed dead mice to, and they'll eat them.
Okay, so I was going to ask, is that a problem with rehabilitation?
No.
It doesn't, okay.
No, it doesn't seem to be.
If they're hungry, they'll eat something which is dead.
Yeah, but if you're offering them food that they recognise, they'll eat it. Yeah.
Okay. Tell me, and I'm sure this changes with the different species that you deal with, but the ultimate aim is to rehabilitate the particular animal back into the wild,
Yes.
to live a natural life.
Yes.
How do you keep them wild? How do you stop yourself from getting too attached to them?
Yeah, it's a question that's often asked. So there are some species that I'm partial to, and we all the rest of the team that are here at the hospital are all partial to certain species. And but the best thing for us is when that animal is a fully independent, functioning, whatever it is, whether it's a honey badger or a caracal or whatever species that is. When you see that animal out in the wild, when it's gone through that lengthy rehab process, and you go out there and it doesn't approach you, or it runs away from you,
Okay.
or you see it interacting with a wild conspecific, another one of its kind.
Yep.
And even breeding, which we've had, that is your ultimate aim, and that is like the cherry on the top. That's fantastic. So you don't want to keep it a pet. I mean, that's not the aim at all. And when you're hand raising, a tiny little thing, it's very sweet, and it's very nice to have a secret peep into their world, because you get to learn such a lot about that particular species, about their needs and their requirements. But I mean, it's like having your own child. When it starts walking, that's great, and when it goes to school, it's great, and then hopefully it goes off into the world and earns its own money and only comes back once a week for lunch, and that's great. You know? And that's the kind of aim with these animals and birds as well, to get them independent and fully functioning.
You mentioned you've looked after literally hundreds of species.
Yes.
Over the time.
Yeah.
Within species, do they have characters? And within the specific species itself, are they quite different characters?
Yeah. So I mean, honey badgers are generally behave like honey badgers, but each individual honey badger has its own personality as well. So it's really interesting to see those. There's some honey badgers that have their own little quirks and their own little idiosyncrasies, just like we do.
Yeah.
The pangolins that we work with, every single pangolin is different in their requirements and their habits and their, what they need and what they do. So they do all have personalities, and it's not anthropomorphizing it. They do. We work with them, we see it. They do. They have their own personalities.
Okay. For the people who didn't do biology, beyond 13 years of age,
Yes.
Can you describe that word, which had lots of syllables in it?
Anthropomorphisms. It means sort of humanizing an animal, so attributing human qualities or emotions to an animal.
Right.
So, I mean, we try not to baby talk them, but
Yep.
we don't. But they do have personalities, and they also do have emotions. Animals are sentient beings, and they have emotion, and we see it all the time.
As I was setting up earlier on, Nicci, I almost stumbled across a bunch of tortoises.
The herd of tortoises.
Is that what they are? They're a herd?
No, they're not. Yeah.
And I also, and in all of these other pens, that you have a number of other animals which ordinarily wouldn't be in such close proximity to one another in the wild. They might even be fierce rivals. So how's that managed here at the hospital?
Well, I mean, most of these animals would be in close proximity. They'd be living in the same habitat, so they would sort of move away from each other. But I mean, they've got the choice then to move away from each other.
Yep.
But obviously, we wouldn't put a prey species right next to a predator species.
Sure.
So that we would definitely try and avoid.
Yep.
And as you can see, all the cages are heavily shade clothed, so that's to give the animal privacy, and so that they aren't seeing people all the time, and they're not being disturbed by, cleaning and activities outside.
Okay. Are the tortoises, are they in a rehabilitation program or
these tortoises are all confiscated tortoises, so they've all come in through SPCA's branches, or people that are moving. You get a tortoise like that big black one over there that's emerging.
Yeah, wow.
And I mean, she might be 55 years old, and she may have come from a lady might have picked her up when she was in her 20s, and now she's going into an old age home, and needs somewhere for her Myrtle or Martha or whatever it is to go to that's going to be safe, and they entrust those animals to us. So that's the sort of scenario that these tortoises come from.
So are they more in a retirement village themselves, the tortoises, as opposed to being put back into the wild?
Yeah. Well, the tortoises are in a sort of quarantine set up here because we need to make sure that they don't have diseases that they could spread to wild populations. So they're a sort of separately managed situation. They're slightly different to the others.
And they have their own characters?
Kind of, yeah. I suppose so, yeah. They each have their own little idiosyncrasies. If you sat and watched them, you'd soon pick that up. You'd get a bossy one and a shy one and a,
Yep. How big's your team here at the hospital?
We have our vet, Dr. Corinne Lawrence, and the veterinary hospital is registered in her name because that's how it has to work legally. And then we have Penelope Morkel, who has worked with me for about 8 years, also a rehab specialist. We have Michelle, who runs the day-to-day operations here as a sort of clinic manager and in conjunction with all of us, and me. And then we've got a couple of auxiliary people who we just wouldn't be able to function very well without it all. And we do have a very small volunteer base of well-trained people that we rely on as well.
Do they have a rehabilitation specialisation?
Background?
Yeah.
Yes, they do. They've all worked with me over a number of years and have had good training, done training courses. So, yeah.
On your website, it mentions that you would like the hospital to become a training facility for those who are interested in becoming wildlife vets.
Yes.
I might just wait for the plane to go overhead there. How's that progressing?
I think it will progress. I mean, this hospital's only been open about 1.5 years. So, I mean, ultimately what we'd love is, and we have had veterinary students, final year veterinary students come through and do their internship with us. And so it's wonderful exposing them to a whole range of different wildlife, how you hold a raptor in the hand so that you don't get nailed by those talons, what to look for when you get, I don't know, owls in, there's certain things that you would look for, how you rehab those birds and animals. So that when they've qualified and they go off and work in various practices all around the country or all around the world, they'll have an idea, first of all, of how to handle the animal without getting hurt and to keep the animal safe, and secondly of all, just what to look for. Because they don't get a lot of that training at the university, the veterinary training university, Onderstepoort. So it's great to just expose them to a variety of stuff that we do. And we have veterinary nurses come through here as well to do their 2-week elective, which is great. They're hugely helpful and very enthusiastic, and we love teaching. I love teaching, so it's a two-way street. It works well for us. But we'd love to have, like a full-on teaching hospital where you would have people coming and doing a year's internship, and you could train them up really well. That would be the ultimate goal, in sort of 5 to 10 years or something like that.
Just going back a little bit, you mentioned the meerkats. It's legal to have those as pets. Obviously, and I imagine this is the case for veterinary students, their big thing is, cats and dogs and horses perhaps.
Yes.
What's illegal to have as a pet in South Africa?
Any indigenous wildlife.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite a lot of animals.
Yeah, it's everything. All the wildlife that occurs here naturally.
How much prosecution is there of people who are involved in illegal trade or illegal pets industry?
It depends. Sometimes people will get a fine or they'll get a warning, or it generally starts off like that depending on who they are and what the scenario is. There are cases that have gone to court, but it generally would end up with a fine or a suspended sentence. There are other animals, what we call top species, which are threatened or protected species, which are being poached at a rate of knots, with organised syndicates and crime syndicates. And they obviously would have much higher sentences, and some of them have been sentenced to jail time. So,
have you been involved in any operations of that nature?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Are you willing to talk about those at all?
I can do if you like. Yeah.
Sure, please.
So I'm often asked to write affidavits or statements to support dockets, police dockets with confiscated animals, especially the pangolins, which we do treat here at the hospital. So I do get involved with the legal side. Yeah.
We're going to do another chat, Nicci, about pangolins.
That's why I'm sort of hetating, because that's going to come into the
we'll
the
get
pangolin
there.
side of things too.
We'll do another podcast on those. I know it's a whole other story. It's a huge problem. I was staggered when I read the statistics about the nature of the illegal pangolin trade.
Yeah.
So we can park that for a moment. I mean,
Yeah.
there's plenty of other problems that you have to deal with right now, right?
Yeah, there are. We can say that the hospital is very proficient at treating pangolins. Pangolins are very, very specific. They're like one of a kind animal in their veterinary treatment, their husbandry, their care. They're such peculiar, unique animals, and Dr. Corinne Lawrence has become probably a leading expert in the country on pangolin.
Nicci, I'm going to make a small confession here, is that up until a few months ago I didn't know what a pangolin was. I know, I feel chastened. Look, I was aware of anteaters, but I didn't know what they were, so perhaps you could just briefly talk about what a pangolin is and how you rehabilitate it here at the hospital.
So I think CITES 2016, which happened, CITES being the international convention which looks at different animals in the world and all the trade that goes on, and which animals are threatened and which animals aren't threatened, and which appendix to move them to, appendix 1, 2 or 3. Are we going to allow trade with rosewood out of Zambia, or are we going to allow sea anemones to be traded in Indonesia or wherever it is? It's all the different species. It's fascinating, and it's over a week, and all the countries come together, all the leading experts in the world, and all these incredible species come together. And in 2016 we were lucky enough to host it here in South Africa, so I could attend, and pangolin were a big buzzword, because it suddenly came to light that there's so much heavy trafficking of pangolin all around the world. We've got 4 species in Asia and 4 species in Africa, and the Asian ones are way on the decline now because of the Asian demand, in demand. And so of course they're focusing attention to Africa's 4 species, and we're being hit really badly. So after that publicity from CITES, suddenly we were amazed at a lot more people knowing what a pangolin was.
It's actually not the knocking which I'm looking at the 2 tortoises. One's trying to get a lift. Is that what's happening over there?
I don't think so,
No,
Richard, no.
Mating tortoises.
Yes, they are mating.
I don't know if I wish I had a cameraman here. I could. This one's coming over to watch.
Well, it is spring.
It is spring.
So
there
it's
you
warming
go.
up,
The
and
birds are in the air.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
You were talking about originally what unique creatures they are.
Yes, yeah. So what I was getting at was that after CITES, the general public internationally or globally was much more aware of what the animal is, but there's still, large amounts of people that don't know what they are, and because of that, they don't realise how critical the status is with pangolin.
So how would you describe a pangolin to a novice?
Somebody who's never seen one or heard of one.
Yeah.
It is a mammal. It's the only mammal with scales on Earth.
Right.
I mean, it's fascinating. It's got this armoured, and they're individual scales. So it's not like an armadillo from South America, which has got one big scale kind of
shell
covering. Yeah. So they have individual scales, which is just like a suit of armour, and they roll into a ball very, very tightly, which you cannot open. So they have no natural predators.
Simply because they can't be unrolled and eaten.
Unrolled, unless they're tiny, and then you might get a honey badger trying its luck with one. But essentially, their only predator is people.
And they eat ants?
They eat ants. They're myrmecophagous, which means ant eating only. Very, very specific specialist feeders.
And are they, I must say, I've never seen one on safari. Is that because they're nocturnal animals, or?
They're so cryptic, people just don't see them. I mean, you can walk past a clump of vegetation and there could be one lying right there at your feet and you wouldn't see it. They're very, very cryptic. So, I mean, there are people that have been going to Kruger Park for 30 years and never seen one. So it's a very special sighting. When you do see a pangolin, it's kind of like a bush blessing in a way.
And the ones which arrive at the hospital, what's the normal story? How have they arrived here?
They've all been poached.
Okay.
So they are all part of this horrendous poaching that is going on.
Yep.
They all will have spent at least a week in a sack or a backpack or a suitcase or a wire cage that they've been wired into, or some other horrific thing. They will often have pneumonia. They'll often have, they'll be starving, they'll be dehydrated. They'll often have wounds, and they'll often have, a load of external parasites on them because their whole has been compromised, immune system. So they're in a bad way when they get here. Every single pangolin is compromised when it comes in.
And do you work with the anti-poaching units to train them to identify what is a healthy pangolin, what is an unhealthy one, or do you say, listen, as a matter of course,
they all
bring
come
them,
here.
send them through, we'll check them out?
Yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah.
Because we've had in the past people or law enforcement officers, in far-flung corners of the country, just releasing a pangolin and it's died. Because, it might look okay. People don't know what they are. They've never seen one before, so how do they know that it looks okay? And they've released them, and the animal is just way too compromised. It's like sometimes taking a very, very starving person. Like concentration camp survivors. You can't just sit them down to a 3-course dinner. It would kill them.
Yep.
So there's a very slow, careful way of introducing fluids and liquids and that kind of thing to slowly eke them back.
How widespread, or rather, what's its throughout Africa? Where do you find pangolin?
We have a species called the Temminck's ground pangolin, which occurs in the arid areas of South Africa, going into the bushveld, across into Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and it occurs right up to the Sudan. And then in Central Africa, you get a pangolin that we all thought was extinct until somebody had a capture of it on a camera trap. And there it was, this magical, mythical creature in the Congo. So we're all desperate to go and have a look at that or find them. So you've got these big giant pangolin which go up to about 35 kgs in Central Africa in the forests, and then you have 2 arboreal species, tree pangolins, a beautiful black-bellied pangolin, which is the prettiest thing you've ever seen. It's like a jewel, and then you get the white-bellied pangolin, and they're from sort of West Africa all the way across to Cameroon and Central African Republic in the forests.
Well, I certainly look forward to chatting more about pangolins when we do that other podcast.
Sure.
In terms of, you mentioned that you have animals coming all throughout, through South Africa specifically. How do they? What's a typical story? Something gets found in the Western Cape. The vet knows about you, and then what's the process which happens from then on?
So, I mean, as an example, we had a tiny little pink-faced baboon come through. She was called Kira. Somebody named her. And what had happened was, we suspect that a farmer had been shooting baboons on the farm, as they do, because it may be raiding crops, or I don't know why these things happen. And probably what had happened was, when they came up to the animals that they'd shot, they'd found this little tiny baby clinging to its dead mother. It's a typical scenario. And they took it through to their local SPCA. And the SPCA was in a far-flung corner of the Western Cape, very remote, and they had to get it to, we had to organise through the National Council that it was flown out of Uppington and brought through to our main airport and collected from there and then brought through to us. So that's a a wonderful story, because all sorts of people are involved, and you've got airlines flying this tiny little mite for free, and everybody getting involved, and people, it helps you to see. I mean, we see a lot of the worst side of people here, and the cruelty and all of that side, that sort of thing, but you also get to see, as in that story, people pulling together for this tiny little thing. And it's really gratifying.
And then does the reverse happen in much the same way? You've tended the animal, you've managed to maybe reintroduce it to another troop of baboons, and then other people are willing to raise the hand in terms of transporting it back to its natural habitat.
Yeah, we do. We get amazing people helping us. So all the primates go to a particular primate rehabilitation facility that we use, and we've used for years.
Okay.
So they go into their own process, and we trust them implicitly with that.
Yep.
So already Kira is in with other little baby baboons, and they're all living together and rough and tumbling together, and being little baboons, which is essential. And they'll be introduced to another group of slightly older baboons, and eventually they'll get introduced into a big group of baboons, which will be in a huge they've got about a 2-hectare camp that they put all the baboons into, and they're free ranging and foraging, and eventually, when they've got enough numbers together and everybody's cohesively behaving like baboons, then they all get transported to a release enclosure and released from there and monitored, so they're all doing very well. So I mean, there are all sorts of people that help with all these cases along the way. I mean, people are just amazing. I mean, when we've had emergencies with wildlife, like the confiscated pangolin up in the bush somewhere in Limpopo that needs to come through urgently, we often deal with the battleurs, which is an NGO of pilots that fly for conservation, and they'll put a call out to all their pilots, and we'll get offers of pilots to fly us from Lanseria up to Hoedspruit, pick up the pangolin, fly all the way back again. So that saves us hours, because as you know, it's sort of 5.5 hours drive to Hoedspruit and 5.5 back, and it's quite heavy to do that in a day, there and back. But these pilots do it for free. They help us, and they're thrilled to help. So we're really fortunate. There's a good network of really good people out there that help us.
Something you touched on just now, you mentioned the problems in this country. In a country where there are enormously high rates of HIV and crime and violence and all of the woes.
All the happy stuff.
Yeah, all the happy stuff. I mean, some people say, why should we bother about these animals instead of looking after these human problems? What would be your answer to that?
My answer to that is that everything has to be looked after, and there are specialists that look after all the human side of it, and there are specialists that have chosen to work with animals because that's where their calling is. This is not a job. I've wanted to do this since I was 4, and it's a calling, and you can't go against that. You just can't. So that's what you do, and I think that everything makes up an environment or a community. We've got people and we've got wildlife, and everything's in trouble. So all those different aspects have to be assisted and helped. And if I can assist wildlife, then that's what I choose to do.
Are you hopeful?
For wildlife? Some days.
Yeah.
Hopeful for bits and pieces. But generally it's, I think there's a lot against wildlife, but there are a lot of good people fighting for wildlife in this country too. As you've just seen down in Parliament, the last 2 days, discussing the lion bone issue and the trade with lions. There's a lot of very powerful people, a lot of very good people, and that gives me hope, just to see our wildlife community pulling together and working together.
Well, there's got to be the realization that it's such a part of Africa, right? Of South Africa. Yeah. It's one of the things which distinguishes your countries and country from other parts of the world is the wildlife, and it needs to be looked after.
It's our heritage.
Your heritage,
actually,
precisely.
It's our heritage, and it makes me damn angry that people are taking it, and plundering it, which is what they're doing.
You mentioned before about the urban sprawl as the urban encroaches on the wilderness. What can people practically do to? They might not have all of the skills, but can they take some measures in their garden, the way they go about their daily lives in terms of minimising the risk to the wildlife?
Sure, there really are some very basic things like don't use poison.
Okay.
Don't use poison on your flower beds, on your plants, because that will affect all your insect-eating birds and animals. And don't use rodenticide at all. It doesn't work.
Rodenticide?
Rat poison.
Okay.
Yeah. So, people fling out rat poison, and it's not. It hasn't worked. We've still got rats.
Yep.
So rather manage your waste, manage your compost heaps, encourage owls, and don't use poison because it affects so many other species as well. Very dangerous stuff.
Okay. Why don't we talk about your backstory? How did you get into it? You mentioned before that you were you've known about this since you were 4. What path did you take?
A convoluted one is the only answer to that. Yeah. There's no university degree for wildlife rehabilitation, and I didn't study zoology or anything either. So I went the route of getting into it and learning about it and doing it through experience and work. So that's how I got into it. And as a child, volunteered as a vet at a local vet. At a very early age, at about 7, I was in there helping him cut stitches and clean dogs' kennels and that sort of stuff. And then as a teenager, volunteering at various wildlife organisations. And then I took a couple of years to have my own offspring, and then got back into it and been doing it for about 18, 20 years now.
Have advances in science over the years made a big improvement? Have you seen that?
I think so, yeah.
Can you give some examples?
Well, I think the scientific community has seen now and accepted that wildlife rehabilitation is a profession. It's not just funny old ladies doing stuff in their backyard with doves and pigeons, or whatever it is. And we have a role to play in research and scientific studies, and which we do here, and I have done all along. I really like that. I find it very stimulating to have people coming for samples or carcasses, or wanting us to participate in their research, because we have our hands on so many animals, and we're privy to so much that goes on, and a lot of students might not have that benefit, So we've been involved in all sorts of scientific projects, and it's very, very interesting what is being researched. So from that point of view, it's fascinating, and I think just with wildlife medicine, there's huge strides, because wildlife is a big business, especially in this country. You've got game reserves, you've got capture teams, you've got breeding facilities, for all your different antelope and buffalo and rhino and that kind of thing. So the veterinary science has had to, pick itself up, and it improves. We're world leaders in that in South Africa. So yeah, I think it's science. I like science. We all like science here at the hospital.
You just mentioned before about a lot of the other organisations, many of whom I assume you work with. How do you make sure that you're dealing with an ethical organisation?
You get to know, you really do. You get to know people, and you get to know the organisations, and you just stick with those ones because you know who they are.
Yep.
When new ones come up, or new people come up, you sort of got a radar, who you would like to work with and who you would choose not to work with.
Right.
I always like to advise. I don't ever turn anybody away if they're looking for advice, because ultimately it's going to lead to helping that animal that they've got their hands on. So I'll always try and help in that aspect. But it's very important, obviously, in any profession to work with ethical people, because it affects your own reputation, doesn't it?
Of course. Look, we're almost out of time, but perhaps halfway through we did quickly mention the Facebook page, your
Yes.
website page.
Yes.
You're here in Gauteng. Is there any other thing that you do? Do you have dinners or
We haven't got time for dinner. No, I'm joking. I'm
there
joking.
are other fundraising efforts?
We do, but because we're such a small team,
Mm.
it's so difficult, you know, to find that extra energy to do fundraisers. But obviously, we need to.
Yep.
And so we'd love ideas, you know, out of the box ideas on different types of fundraisers. So we're open to all of those suggestions and offers of help.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. So, yeah, fundraising is essential, and we need it.
Certainly, if anyone is listening to this podcast or watching this on YouTube, and they live in Joburg or close by, then have a look on the website of the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Hospital, and have a look at the list of the things they need. Perhaps you've got some lying around the storeroom or the house, and you don't need it anymore. And also, obviously, if you come across any injured animals that the hospital can tend and help and rehabilitate into the wild.
Yeah.
Nicci, thank you so much for
Pleasure.
joining me on Tales Less Told.
Thank you very much.